The First Nations in Falls Creek were interesting. They had their village site at Snock, which is today the site of the Vancouver Museum and the Academy of Music, just on the other side of the Broad Bridge. So Falls Creek was quite sort of the, I guess, food gathering area for many of the First Nations here. The industrialization of Falls Creek is actually quite early on. The City of Vancouver officially exists in 1886, and by that time the railway, Canadian Pacific Railway, had already started constructing its rail yards on the north shore of Falls Creek around what is today Yaletown. And then very quickly after that, because of the forests that were around, forestry, wood cutting, so log booming, that type of thing very quickly, and then some very early shipyards as well. What became the Canadian National Railway and the Great Northern Railway petitioned the city government for permission to actually fill the far eastern end of Falls Creek. It was primarily mud flats. The Canadian National Railway got the center of the creek. Great Northern had the horseshoe ring on the outside. And so they started commencing filling the creek just before the First World War. It wasn't finished until near the end of the war.
Most of the suppliers that were manufacturing equipment that went in the BC-built ships were all located within a few mile radius of Falls Creek. And so, for example, the anchor winches we bought from the foot of Main Street Broad Iron Works. The whistles were Air Chime, the same one that's on top of the BC Hydro Tower. Between the First World War and the Second World War, we got a large number of sawmills on the creek. At one point, I think there was almost 15 sawmills just on Falls Creek alone. All of the auxiliary lumber industries, we had shingle mills and various other things. And then, of course, the Second World War brings increased boat building. There's over 4,000 employees at West Coast Shipbuilders during the war. But things were slowing down and the owners of the shipyard decided to close it, which they did. And my father, who had worked under my grandfather at the site, decided to start off in the shipbuilding business. And in November 1948 started Allied Builders with assembly with some of the foremen and earlier members from West Coast Shipbuilders, and they started building what were at the time called little boom boat tugs, little 26-foot tugs. I remember as a very young, maybe 12 years old, going out on sea trials in different vessels. And that was always kind of fun because first you go through the old Cambie Street Bridge was a swing bridge, and as we timed that for the tide, that would usually put a traffic jam on both sides of Cambie Street as they opened the swing bridge. And as farther went, there was a Kitsilano railway trestle with very low clearance under it. And what they used to do there is they'd bring barges underneath the trestle at a lower tide, and then float, as the barge came up, it would float the trestle out. The bridge itself would take it out. They'd move it out of the way, then our ship could go through, and then the next tide they'd bring the barge back and sink the railway trestle back in place. So it wasn't the easiest place to carry on marine commerce.
With the end of the war, you ended up having some industries which had expanded, started to contract, but also the realization that a lot of the industry here were in outdated facilities, and the fire hazard was very real. And in fact, on Granville Island, the number of small fires and a few major fires that broke out started to convince people that maybe this really nasty, heavy industry was not the best thing to have right in the center of the city. And by 1968, the city decided that big changes were needed, and they actually lifted the industrial zoning along Falls Creek. And by lifting that opened it up for all sorts of other opportunities.
There were still people at that time who felt that we should have industry there and we should not dislodge the industry. They felt that the jobs were very important and they would be lost. The notion that you could have parks, schools, and residents seemed far-fetched to them. The fact of the matter was, we owned all that land, and when we turned it into parks, schools, and housing, it was worth far more than it was as industrial land.
And then the real sort of big change really was Expo 86. The Canadian Pacific Railway had floated a plan through its Realty on Marathon in the 70s for a district on the North Shore of towers and parks and things. It was met with a fair amount of opposition. So there was a land swap deal with the provincial government, and Expo 86 came out of that. And at the end of the fair, you then had this huge chunk of land owned by one owner, the provincial government, and it was sort of, now what do we do? And I think probably the fateful decision was not to sell the land off piecemeal, but to sell it to one developer. And that developer, of course, the Concord Pacific Company, and they have then embarked on that very long-range plan to develop that whole North Shore. And then the last piece of the puzzle really for Falls Creek is that last little piece down at the southeast end. Of course, the impetus for change there is the Athletes Village, which will show up for the 2010 Olympics. So that'll be sort of the last piece of the puzzle, which will then see the complete transformation of the entire creek.
We want to know what you think about this story. Call us at 604-871-6245 or email us at gvtv@vancouver.ca. Visit our website, vancouver.ca/gvtv, for video, essential links, and much more.